February is Black History Month in this country. I'm John Hanson. Join me this week on In Black America.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was probably the best-known black nationalist of the day.
Black freedom fighters this week on In Black America.
This is In Black America, reflections of the black experience in American society.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was probably the best-known black nationalist of the day. He comes again, as do many black leaders, out of the times. It is a time of disillusionment. Again, the economy is not good. The depression character to the times. The world is not made safe for democracy. Black people are having a tough time in their urban sojourn. The streets are not quite as golden as they appeared from the South. Dashed hopes and expectations.
Dr. John Warfield. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican-born black nationalist who gave Black America a new vision during the 1920s. At the height of his notoriety in the 1920s, he announced the formation of an African republic and dazzled Black America with parades and pageants. In 1925, Marcus Garvey was convicted on a charge of using the U.S. mail to defraud in connection with the financing of the Black Star Line, his steamship company. Today, Representative Charles Rangel of New York and other black leaders are organizing a national movement calling for a reevaluation of Marcus Garvey's legacy. I'm John L. Hanson, Jr., and in celebration of Black History Month, we spotlight two black freedom fighters, Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, in Black America. February is Black History Month in this country. For 51 years, Negro History Week, later changing to Black History Week, was the most dramatic and popular vehicle for educating Americans on the contributions and achievements of Afro-Americans to our society and the world. During the American Bicentennial celebration in 1976, the observance of Afro-American history was extended to the full month of February and has continued ever since. In this week's program, we focus on two black freedom fighters, Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a militant Pan-African leader. He preached a new gospel of Africa for Africans at home and abroad. Born in Jamaica, he built his first mass movement among urban blacks. Marcus Garvey established a chain of cooperative businesses, including a black steamship line called the Black Star Line. In 1925, Marcus Garvey was arrested and convicted on a charge of using the U.S. mail to defraud in connection with the financing of the Black Star steamship line. 2 years later, he was deported, but never gave up his efforts to create an Africa for Africans at home and abroad. I spoke with Dr. John Warfield regarding the life and times of Marcus Garvey. Dr. John Warfield.
He comes out of a working class orientation from a small fishing village in St. Anne's, Jamaica. Comes from a labor movement orientation, is infatuated early on with Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery and the Tuskegee idea of kind of up by your own bootstraps and not depending on the white power structure for success. So Garvey is, although often criticized for his pomp and circumstance, for the pageantry, for the verboseness, as a kind of demagogue and one who maybe detracted from the true essence of his movement, I still think stands very distinctly as one who talked about the question of black pride and the question of nationalism as a kind of cooperative effort between black people. Garvey argued that his was a government in exile, that that black people had a right to Africa, and he argued Africa for the Africans and Europe for Europeans. But he put together essentially Black Star Line and the African Orthodox Church and set up a number of institutional formations that gave some function and substance to what he was talking about, so that the characterization of him as a sham, I think, is untrue. But there was a need, and Garvey filled it at that time.
Before Marcus came to the United States in 1916, he went to England, studied under the Egyptian scholar, and learned much about the African culture, particularly Africans under colonial power. What did he try to articulate once he learned that knowledge and came to the United States in 1916 and became acquainted with Booker T. Washington's teachings?
Well, Garvey argued that you couldn't have citizenship in this country until you had a government, a kingdom behind you. His classical question was, given that very accurate assessment of his work, was where is the black man's kingdom? That's the question he raised to the Afro-Americans in this part of the world. Where was the government? And he argued that one would not attain full citizenship, would not attain a kind of power and economic strength in this country until he had a government behind him. And that essentially was the message.
Marcus Garvey seemed to be a good organizer. How many chapters and members were a part of his Universal Negro Improvement Association?
Well, the chapters in number, John, I'm not so sure in terms of the exact number. About 300,000 people are argued to be a part of this movement at its zenith. The figures vary depending on the scholar, and some of the more recent work, I think, will tighten up those numbers. But at some point, he has a broad-based appeal, particularly to the working class. Things are tough. Again, as I said, black people coming out of the North were looking for golden streets, still in the northern cities. They don't materialize. But he has a very complex organization. He has a kind of paramilitary setup, a corps of what they call a Black Cross as opposed to the Red Cross, a nursing contingent. Again, as I said, there was a religious, the African Orthodox church, which of course God is black. Fairly well thought through notion of what it would be like for black people to be in charge of their own situation. His study of Africa obviously helps him understand and break through a kind of cultural inferiority and get to the notion that black people can and do run things. One of the experiences that I think most black people who've had the opportunity to go to a Caribbean nation or to Africa is that you see black people in charge. I think Richard Pryor and a whole set of other people talk about that in very real seriousness. The joke gets to be over at that point because it's a very different, it's not a visual experience, it's a psychological experience of seeing black people in charge of nations and governments for whatever may be the problems in third world African countries. But that was Garvey's position, and pretty much one of trying to organize a culture, if you will, as well as a nation.
In doing the research and finding out a little bit more about Marcus Garvey, he did run into trouble, spent some time in Atlanta Penitentiary, but it was different stories that it was because of his shystering or mail fraud, and then there was another story where the organizations were infiltrated from the beginning and people were ripping off from the inside. Could you shed some light on that, Dr. Warfield?
Well, I think, John, some of the recent revelations out of the Hoover papers clearly indicate that the Garvey movement was infiltrated. This historical pattern, of course, comes right down through the civil rights movement and all kinds of so-called left-wing and progressive movements. But it's clear that a part of the Garvey difficulties might have very well grown out of some of the internal conflict perpetrated on it. If you read the textbooks prior to some of this more recent evidence that's come forth after J. Edgar Hoover's papers, you begin to appreciate that there were some financial problems. The classical tag, again, one that I guess I'm suspicious of now, was that to some degree there was mismanagement and fraud and some pilfering. Some of the arguments that some of the old school and some of the older black folks and Queen Mother Moore and some folks out of New York who've been around this struggle a long time argue that the movement was highly capitalistic, that it was a handful of black businessmen who saw an opportunity to seize on a venture and exploit it. Granted, I'm not in a good position to debate that, but I think we don't know how much of that is true or false, given what some of the recent revelations are. And I think Garvey, as was King, as was Roy Wilkins, as a whole host of black leadership, are often defamed and castigated as a part of the political strategy of our own government. And I think to that extent, Garvey is a victim of that same kind of maligning.
In your opinion, what station should Garvey be remembered in world history and in black history?
I think Garvey should rank very high. And I think he should rank high in the sense that he conceptualized, John, and operationalized the notion of black nationalism for black people in this country. He put his money where his mouth was. I think, they purchased a ship, although it doesn't, obviously never sails, but the efforts seem genuine in that sense. But I think then the internationalization, Garvey's conceptualization of the circumstance of black people around the world and the need for something to work as a magnet and a coalescing force in what we call the African diaspora. I think Garvey's fundamental in that. Likewise, again, I think in the 60s, we discovered or rediscovered him, as we did Du Bois, and we found out that the notion of nationalism was not new, that black people had been talking about it all along. The signs, Garvey's big on signs and symbols. The black star is ultimately borrowed, if you will, by Kwame Nkrumah and becomes a kind of national symbol in Ghana for its decolonization and political efforts. So if you go to Ghana, there's the Black Star line today, and at the university you'll find a black star at the top of the tower. Number of signs and signals, the red, black, and green flag comes out of the Garvey effort. Some people say, well, that's all there was to it. The ship never sailed. It was a ripoff and so forth. Going back to Africa was foolish. And to some degree, those contrivances come out of the press and from those who were opposed to his effort. But I think that to concretize what being a nationalist was about and what that movement was about is, to his credit, the internationalization of Garvey's effort. He was not the only one, but I think it's meritorious in that sense. And then lastly, that he gave people a sense of being somebody when one doesn't have all the material extensions. It was a way of saying something about pride and worth when things are toughest. And it was successful in that sense. he went against the grain of the Du Bois clique and that clan. I mean, the folks who've been foundational in the Niagara movement, they saw him as a kind of buffoon and a demagogue. But I think that was a kind of class difference and a difference in appeal. The black intellectuals and the black intelligentsia had trouble with Garvey. He had trouble with them because he argued they were high yellow sellouts and folks who weren't really about black people and collaborated much too much with white people. They argued that at some point his was a movement that was separatist and not in the best interest of integration and developments and progress here. Amy Jacques Garvey, his wife, argues that the Back to Africa movement was not advocated for everybody, that Garvey upheld the notion of a kind of civil rights struggle wherever black people were, that he had not proclaimed that all black folks everywhere ought to get on a boat and go back to Africa, but he felt there ought to be some contingent to hold up that kind of institutional end and cease being a government in exile and have, in fact, a government that black people could relate to. But it's a fascinating area in the sense of looking at the contradiction. So there is some antagonism, if you will, between the kind of black business and intelligentsia and Garvey and his primary appeal to the working class.
Dr. John Warfield. Although Marcus Garvey's ideas were rejected by many persons of his day, it is clear that since then, these ideas have strongly influenced the policies of black leaders all around the world. Like Malcolm X, a generation later. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska on May 19, 1925. He was the son of a Baptist minister who was an avid supporter of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. At an early age, he moved to Lansing, Michigan. Young Malcolm left grade school in the 8th grade. Soon thereafter, he moved to New York City, working for a time as a waiter. Soon after that, young Malcolm began selling drugs, turned to burglary, and was sentenced to a 10-year term in 1949. While in prison, he became acquainted with the teachings of the late Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X had a profound influence on both black and white Americans. Many historians believe Malcolm X represented the spirit that was deep in the soul of every black person, even if you never heard it.
Well, as our people, the Afro-Americans, become politically mature, they become very much aware of the recent trend in political elections. They see that every time there's an election recently, there's always a recount, that whites are so evenly divided politically that in many areas the race is so close that they have to count the votes all over again to see who got in office. You had a recount where the governor was concerned in Massachusetts or in Minnesota or in Rhode Island, and the same thing was so close between President Kennedy and Nixon that they had to count the votes all over again. And our people are beginning to see this, and they also realize that any minority group that has a block of votes is able to determine who will be the next mayor or who will be the next governor or who will be the next president or who will be the next congressman or the next senator. And this enables them to see the strategic position that they are in. Also, they realize that it was the black vote that put the present administration in Washington, D.C. It was the black vote here in America that put a Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. And despite the fact that it is admitted by the students of political science that the 22 million Afro-Americans were the ones who put the present administration in power in Washington, D.C., the present administration has put us last. We put them first, but they put us last. And you may say, well, why do I say this? Because they've been down there for 4 years and are only just now getting around to civil rights legislation or doing something about the violation of the civil rights of the 22 million Afro-Americans who put them in power. Now, despite the fact that they claim that they can do nothing about this, when you look at the structure of the senators and the congressmen in Washington, D.C., or the two political parties, we can see where the congressmen are concerned, 257 of them are Democrats, and only 177 of them are Republicans. That means that the Democratic Party controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives, and where the senators are concerned, there are 67 Democratic senators and only 33 Republicans. Controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and also controls 2/3 of the Senate. And despite the fact that they control 2/3 of the House and the Senate and are able to pass all the other type of legislation that comes up, when it comes to the rights of the black people in this country who put them in power, they always have some kind of alibi to give the Negro to try and explain why they have not been able to deliver or keep their promises or the promises that they made when they were running for office. And the alibi that they usually use is they say that the Dixiecrats tie things up. Well, there was a time when black people were politically immature that they thought it was the Dixiecrats that was keeping the Democrats from fulfilling their promise. But today, as Negroes become politically mature, they can see that a Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat in disguise. That you got to be a Democrat before you can be a Dixiecrat. And as our people begin to see this, they also are able to see that it is actually a coalition of Southern Democrats along with the Northern Democrats who actually play a giant political con game to make them at the same time they are not. A good example of this, recently when I was in Washington, D.C., watching the senators filibuster, I noticed that in the back of the Senate room, there was a huge map on the wall showing the states where most of the Negroes lived. And in each one of those states where the majority of the Negroes were living, the senator from that state was involved in a filibuster, which meant that he had to filibuster in order to keep those Negroes from getting voting rights. Because as soon as the Negroes in the southern states get voting rights, they will vote out of office the present racist segregationists who are posing as senators in Washington, D.C. And once the Negro gets the vote and he can oust these southern senators and southern congressmen, then that means the present committees that govern the direction that this government takes in its foreign and domestic policy will be changed because the committee chairman will be changed. And in many instances, they'll have a black senator or a black congressman. The including of black people into the governmental system automatically will mean that the political philosophy of the government will change. The political direction of the government will change. And it will have an effect upon the economy of this particular country. In fact, the 22 million Afro-Americans are in a position to bring about a bloodless revolution where America is concerned, because if America gives complete voting rights and voting power to every person on this continent, it will include overnight a block of 22 million Afro-Americans who have a unique political and economic philosophy. So this means that America, for the first time in history, represents a country that can actually involve itself in a bloodless revolution. All other revolutions in history have been bloody. The Russian Revolution was bloody. The Chinese Revolution was bloody. The French Revolution was bloody. The Cuban Revolution was bloody. Revolutions historically are always bloody. Now, America is in a unique position to involve herself in a bloodless revolution by giving the 22 million Afro-Americans the ballot. And if they don't give the 22 million Afro-Americans the ballot and make possible a bloodless revolution, then they are going to force the Afro-Americans to use the bullet. And it will be a bloody revolution. And this is what I meant when I say the ballot or the bullet. It's the same thing that Patrick Henry meant when he said liberty or death. Well, it's true. Just as it took nationalism to bring about freedom for our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia, it'll take the gospel of black nationalism to bring freedom to the 22 million Afro-Americans here in this country. And we who belong to the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, although Islam is our religious philosophy, our political, economic, and social philosophy is black nationalism. And we adopt this philosophy so that we can work with all other leaders and all other organizations in a program that everybody can become involved in and participate in order to eliminate the political, social, and economic evils that afflict our people. Now, the political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. And the politicians must also be made to take the responsibility for helping to eliminate the evils that afflict our people in our own community. And the economic philosophy of black nationalism only means that our people need to be re-educated into the importance of controlling the economy of our own community, controlling the economy of the community in which we live. And by controlling the economy of the community in which we live, it means that we have to learn how to own and operate the businesses of our community and develop them into some type of industry that will enable us to create employment for the people of our community so that they won't have to constantly be involved in picketing and boycotting other people in other communities in order to get a job. Also, in line with this economic philosophy of black nationalism, in order for us to control the economy of our own community, we have to learn the importance of spending our money in the community where we live. Anyone who knows the basic principles of economics must be aware of the fact that when you take the money out of the neighborhood in which you live and spend it in an integrated neighborhood, or rather in your effort to integrate, you spend it in a neighborhood where you don't live, the neighborhood in which you spend your money becomes wealthier and wealthier, and the neighborhood out of which you take your money becomes poorer and poorer. And this is one of the reasons why wherever you find Negroes, a slum condition usually develops, or we have to live in the ghetto, because all of our wealth is spent elsewhere. And even when we try and spend the money in the neighborhood where we live, usually because we haven't learned the importance of owning and operating businesses, the businesses of our community are usually also controlled by outsiders. The stores are controlled by people who don't even live in our community. So even when we try and spend our money in the neighborhood where we live, we're spending it with someone who puts it in a basket and takes it out as soon as the sun goes down. So the economic philosophy of black nationalism puts the burden upon the black man of learning how to control his own economy. And the social philosophy of black nationalism means that we have to become socially mature to the point where we will realize the responsibility is upon us to elevate the condition, the standard of our community to a higher level. And we can only do this by working together in harmony and unity to in some way eliminate the evils that are destroying the moral fiber of our community. Evils like drug addiction, drunkenness, illegitimacy that's brought about by loose sexual behavior, fornication, and adultery. And once we eliminate these evils that are so destructive to the moral fiber of our community, the level of our society will be higher, and you'll find that our people will be satisfied to live in our own social circles and enjoy life in our own social circles instead of trying to force our way into the social circles of those who don't want us. So as I said, just as it took nationalism to bring about the independence of our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia, the goal or the objective of the political, social, and economic philosophy of black nationalism is designed to bring about the complete independence of the black people in this country by making us become consciously involved in controlling our own community. Once we can control our own communities now, then perhaps we will later be able to control our own country, control our own nation, and govern ourselves, and in some way have control over our own destiny. And in order to bring this about, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated is involved not in trying to spread any religion, but to work with people of all other religions. We will work with our people. We don't care if they are Christian or Jew or Muslim or atheist or agnostic, whatever they are. Our desire is to spread the gospel of black nationalism. We want to evangelize the gospel of black nationalism. And once this gospel of black nationalism is spread among our people, it means that those who are in the Baptist church can remain Baptist, but they take the political, economic, and social philosophy of black nationalism. Those who are Hebrews call themselves black Hebrews. They can still practice their religion, but take the social, political, and economic philosophy of black nationalism. And this philosophy in itself will bring about the independent thinking of the black people in this country and eventually lead to the complete physical independence of the black people in this country.
The late Malcolm X. For the next 2 weeks, In Black America will attend the Goree Island Memorial Services in Dakar, Senegal. If you have a comment or would like to purchase a cassette copy of this program, write us. The address is In Black America, Longhorn Radio Network, UT Austin, Austin, Texas, 78712. For In Black America's technical producer, Cliff Hargrove, I'm John L. Hanson, Jr. Please join us again next week.
You've been listening to In Black America, Reflections of the Black Experience in American Society. In Black America is produced and distributed by the Center for Telecommunications Services at UT Austin and does not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Texas at Austin or this station. This is the Longhorn Radio Network.